So this Siman that I want to discuss today, Siman Kuf Samach Ches to Kuf Samach Tes, is to a certain degree about a lot of the workarounds that used to exist in Hilchos Ribbis before we came up with this concoction known as the heteriska. So it used to be that the way that you would work around Ribbis problems is that you would throw a non-Jew into the transaction and thereby try to do things in a permissible fashion because there's no Ribbis with respect to non-Jews. But as the Siman makes clear, sometimes it's going to be okay. Sometimes you're not going to have a problem, but sometimes it's really just a ruse and a subterfuge, and you are going to have a problem, and it's important to identify when it's okay and when it's not okay. And this helps us understand a little bit more the context and the background of the Rashi in Parshas Behar, on the pasuk Al tikach meito neshek v'sabis v'yaresa me'elokecha, where Rashi says, what is this referring to when we say v'yaresa me'elokecha, that you have to fear God in order to avoid the problems of Ribbis? So Rashi says it's really based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, I think, Hatola ma'osa b'nachri k'dei lehabosam l'Yisrael b'Ribbis harei zeh davar hamaso l'libo shel adam u'l'machshabaso. A person who takes money and says, oh, it's not my money I'm lending out, it's really the non-Jew's money, and he's really the malva in this transaction. So when the Jew lends the money to a different Jew, he's saying it's not my money, Jew number one, that's being loaned to Jew number two, but it's really the non-Jew's money that's being loaned to Jew number two. So often you would have people who would make up stories of this sort, but the stories wouldn't be true, in order to avoid problems of Ribbis. And this gives you a much better understanding of the entire background of this Siman, and how there were many shenanigans in this regard, and why there are so many different types of scenarios that are discussed to determine when it really is a problem, when it's not a problem. But the first question that might occur to somebody, although certainly having nothing to do whatsoever with the halachos of this Siman, is why, of all the other simanim in Shulchan Aruch, does this one get two simanim attributed to it, that is called Siman Kuf Samach Ches to Kuf Samach Tes? It looks to me, and to any presumably layperson who would look at it as one Siman, why does it have the canard of two simanim? So there's a practical explanation. And I mean, I might say that maybe the best explanation is to demonstrate that this Siman is at least twice as hard as any other Siman in Hilchos Ribbis. But the practical explanation brought by the Hagos for Ha'oros to the Torah, printed in the Torah, most of Shiras Devara, is that there were different printings of the Torah. Remember, this first came up with printings of the Torah, not the Shulchan Aruch. In one of the tefusim of the printings of the Torah, Faibi Dishako and Shnas Reish Lamed Hey, the Siman of Kuf Samach Zayin somehow was skipped altogether. And therefore what we have as a Siman Kuf Samach Zayin appeared, meaning that the number Kuf Samach Zayin, not the words of Siman Kuf Samach Zayin, but the number Siman Kuf Samach Zayin was skipped. And therefore what we have is our Siman Kuf Samach Zayin appeared in that printing of the Torah as Siman Kuf Samach Ches, and therefore this appeared as Kuf Samach Tes. So we've corrected that omission, and we put Kuf Samach Zayin back on the map. But as a result, just so that there would be a similar pagination or a similar numerology, beginning with Siman Kuf Ayin, we just made Kuf Samach, the next Siman, into which previously was Kuf Samach Tes, into a hyphenated Siman of Kuf Samach Ches to Kuf Samach Tes. And there's a second explanation as well, which is that in the edition of the Torah that was printed together with the Drisha and the Prisha, I don't know why these problems only arose with respect to Hilchos Ribbis, but what we have is Siman Kuf Samach. In this particular printing of the Torah, Siman Kuf Samach was split up into two different simanim. So it was split into Kuf Samach and Kuf Samach Aleph, so that our Kuf Samach Aleph became their Kuf Samach base, and so forth and so forth. And thus our Kuf Samach Zayin became their Kuf Samach Ches. So therefore, in order for us as well to catch up over here, we had to make the next Siman into a combination Siman of Kuf Samach Ches to Kuf Samach Tes. So at least starting with Kuf Ayin everybody would be exactly on the same page. It's kind of like having a double parsha here in America to catch up with the parshios in Eretz Yisrael, especially after Pesach, when sometimes, depending on if the last day of Pesach falls out on Shabbos or not, they can end up ahead of us in terms of the parshios. But as I said, there could also be a hashkacha, how Yona over here, that's transmitting the message that Talmidim should get double credit for learning the Siman. Now, I started a project a number of years ago, that the previous time that our Kollel learned Hilchos Ribbis, of having picture diagrams for this Siman, much like the Sefarim that have come out in previous years with the pictures of the different scenarios in Maseches Yevamos, Maseches Kinem, that do a very, very fine job. And I still haven't gotten it perfected, but I have to give special credit, particularly to Moishy Rothman, if he's listening to this Chaburah from our Kollel, who helped me a great deal in refining and color coding the drawings and the explanations and so forth. But it's still a work in progress. I should mention that this idea did not originate with me. It actually originated with none other than Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik. Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, in his doctoral thesis, which is printed in the Collected Essays, Volume 1 of Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, his doctoral thesis that he did for Hebrew University. So he wrote about different pointing type transactions that took place between Jews and non-Jews in the Middle Ages in order to avoid problems of Ribbis. And he thought that in order to illustrate the transactions in the most effective fashion, he would make picture diagrams. So I think he hired an artist, and he explained why it is that the Jew has the pointy hat, and why the Gentiles were clean-shaven, and how this was done all based on very careful historical research, etc., etc. And he has two different, no, this is not Shakespearean, he has two different diagrams, one called the pawn, and the other is called Shanemen, which were two different types of transactions that relate a little bit to Siman Kuf Samech Ches. Interestingly enough, the case of the pawn is actually represented in Siman in Sif Yud Ches, which is probably has the most convoluted scenario of the entire Siman. Alone, it's described as a sale, and therefore it's okay. So that all seems to be described in the drawing, which is called the pawn. The other case of Shanemen, where there is a loveh who is somehow short of cash, but they gave a mashkon to the malvin, tells the mashkon, hey, why don't you go and sell it? So this is interesting because the scenario that he has is with a Jewish borrower and a non-Jewish lender. And there is a similar scenario in Sif Yud Beis with a non-Jewish borrower and a Jewish lender. And later on in Sif Chavav, with a Jewish borrower and a Jewish lender, but his scenario of the Jewish borrower and the non-Jewish lender does not actually seem to appear directly in Siman Kuf Samech Ches, Kuf Samech Tes, although maybe it was, there are no references as far as I could find in his article to anything in the Shulchan Aruch. There were a lot of references to various Godim, I don't know, Rishonim that may not necessarily have made it to the page. But certainly there does seem to be precedent for trying to explain the very complicated and convoluted cases of this Siman in actual pictures and cartoon diagrams, and therefore I feel that Baruch Hashem, I'm in very good company, and all of us who are engaged in this endeavor are in very good company. And I have to give credit as well to others who have followed suit. I believe Rav Ike has followed suit in his Halakhapedia page with some very fine drawings. And Moishy as well has also come up with his own drawings based on the work that we did together. So I haven't given up on the project, but I feel that it's wonderful that this has become sort of a joint project of our entire Yodin Kollel. Kol Amabe Reis and Meshubach and Kollel Rosh Zakas Bo Yova V'Yizke. And to the extent that this could be Mabitz Torah and Lahagdil Torah Lahadiva to help to bring to light a better understanding of these different case scenarios, then Matov U Manoim. Now, one of the other things that I've tried to do over the years is to articulate certain Kalalim that can be gleaned from the Siman. And I believe that from a learning perspective, this is on some level the most useful tool in terms of enhancing our understanding of both the Siman in general and also these particular Klallim that are applicable to really all of Hilchos Ribbis that emerge from this Siman, so that it gives us a greater overview, I think, of Hilchos Ribbis if we can hone in on some of the Klallim, and that's what I wanted to focus upon in this Chaburah. So, first of all, what I'll call principle number 1, and if you look at the list, I really have 10 different principles, but principle number 1 is simply the most obvious and basic one, but you have to start with basic foundations if you're going to build upon your principles, and that is Ribbis from one Jew to another Jew is always a problem, however structured. So you can structure it in all kinds of Rube Goldberg complicated ways, but it's still going to be usher. However, by the same token, Ribbis from a Jew to a non-Jew, or from a non-Jew to a Jew, is not a problem. And so the Siman examines primarily the question, when is something Ribbis? When you have a Jew and a non-Jew. Well, let's put it this way. I have 2 Jews and I have a non-Jew in the mix. Now, the Jew can be in the middle, what we call akum in the middle, or the Jew can be on either side, either end of the transaction. So you basically have 3 different combinations that could potentially be problematic or okay, depending on the facts and circumstances. And the Siman in the beginning, up until Sif Tez Zayin, from Sif Aleph to Sif Tez Zayin, really goes through methodically and systematically 3 of the variations that are possibilities, not a 4th, and we'll explain why. The first variation is if I have an akum lender, right, non-Jewish lender, and I have a Jewish borrower, but there's a Jew in the middle. That's from Sif Aleph to Sif Daled. Sif Daled, not really so much, but it's really a logical continuation, really Sif Aleph to Sif Gimel, and then Daled is just telling you a byproduct of it. And then the next is a Jewish lender, Jewish borrower, and akum in the middle. That's from Sifim Hey to Yud Beis. And then you have a Jewish lender, akum, a non-Jewish borrower, and a Jew in the middle. That's from Sifim Yud Gimel to Tez Zayin. And then from Sif Yud Zayin until the end of the Siman Sif Chub Zayin, not quite as disciplined, but, what do you expect? What do you want? You have these 3 very clear methodologies for the first 16 Sifim, and at that point, you can manage on your own. At that point, you can manage. So there are variations of the above. So what I did in the first part of the source sheet is that I told you which Sifim after Tez Zayin relate to each one of these 3 different categories, so you can break it down in that particular way. Now, what we don't have is, we don't have the scenario of a non-Jewish lender and a non-Jewish borrower and a Jew in the middle. Why is it that we don't have that 4th scenario? Anybody?
The Catholic Church took care of it already.
Because it's clearly not going to be a Ribbis problem. I assume that's what you mean. Because there's no possibility there of Ribbis from a Jew to a non-Jew, because in order for there to be a problem of Ribbis, you need at least 2 Jews. I mean, we discussed that in the past. Maybe if both the lender and the borrower are the same Jew. So this is what to discuss in terms of worrying or not worrying about Dilma Asi L'Misrach. But you certainly don't have to worry about Dilma Asi L'Misrach when either the lender or the borrower is clearly not Jewish. So that's why you only have these 3 different scenarios. So that's sort of the first foundational principle that emerges from the Siman. That's the overriding principle of the Siman. Now, the second principle is Ein Shlichus La'akum, that there is no agency. This is a tricky word when it comes to this Siman. Tricky word. There's no agency when it comes to a non-Jew, meaning from a D'Oraisa perspective, a Jew cannot appoint, it would not be effective. A Jew cannot effectively appoint. The non-Jew is a shliach, and a non-Jew cannot effectively appoint a Jew as a shliach. This means that whenever shlichus would potentially result in a kula, that leniency will not be available with respect to a non-Jew. Now, this is important because while a Jew could appoint another Jew to lend to a non-Jew, let's say that you had a valid shlichus transaction where Jew number, we'll call the first one, the lender, Jew number 1, and Jew number 1 appoints a shliach, that's a Jew number 2. If Jew number 2 is really only a shliach, and that does not have any real Ribbis type of liability or indebtedness towards a Jew number one, he's really only a shliach. So then it would be perfectly fine for Jew number one to appoint Jew number two to lend money on his behalf to a non-Jew. We have that in Sif Yud Gimel. Sif Yud Gimel spells out in a very extensive detail all of the conditions to make sure that there is no responsibility on the part of Jew number two, and Jew number one is assuming every single aspect of responsibility that you can ever imagine in terms of the loan there, the loan back, the mashkon, the coming, the mashkon going, every kind of responsibility on his own. So when you have that type of situation, so then that would be perfectly fine. That's spelled out in Sif Yud Gimel, Sif Yud Daled, Sif Tez Zayin, and Sif Chof Zayin, the end of the Siman as well. Or, for that matter, one Jew who wants to be the borrower, Jew number two, can appoint Jew number one and say, hey, go to this non-Jew, tell the non-Jew, you have zero responsibility. You're not taking any responsibility upon yourself. You're just my shliach, and you're my shliach in order to transmit the loan to me from the non-Jew. Also perfectly fine. That we have in Sif Yud Zayin, and that we have in Sif Chav Vav. In the source sheet, I wrote Tez Zayin, Chav Zayin. You can correct it. Yud Zayin, Chav Vav should be the correct sifim for that. And that would be perfectly valid, okay? So, however, even though that would be valid if I have one Jew appointing another Jew, a non-Jew cannot appoint, at least not as a shliach, a Jew to borrow or to lend on his behalf. Now, this is different. This is different from a situation of Ma'aseh Kof. That's why I said Shlichos is complicated. If it's a Ma'aseh Kof, you can have a mailman. You can definitely have a mailman be appointed. For example, a non-Jew appoints a mailman to bring a loan to Jew number two, and the mailman happens to be Jew number one. That would be perfectly fine because he's only a mailman. He's only doing a Ma'aseh Kof. It's like doing an act of a monkey. That doesn't matter at all. A shliach has some degree of personal responsibility for the item that he's holding, some degree that will go away when the money is then transmitted to the next party. But Ma'aseh Kof is a different story. Okay, so we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that. That's important. So this notion of Ein Shlichos L'Akum plays out as early on as Sif Aleph. I've tried as much as possible to go in the order of the Siman in terms of articulating the principles for purposes of this year. So this plays out already in Sif Aleph. This is the case where we have Jew number one who borrowed from a non-Jew Ribbis, and then the non-Jew says to Jew number one, to name the Yisrael Zeh v'hi pater. Go and give from the money that I gave you, and give to Jew that money to Jew number two, and you'll be off the hook. You'll be off the hook. So Jew number one gives the money to Jew number two, but it's only at the behest of the original non-Jewish lender. Behest equals, in our terminology, shlichus. It doesn't work. Doesn't work. So therefore, what ends up happening is that when Jew number one gives the money to Jew number two and says to direct his payments even though he's saying to direct the payments to the non-Jew, we know already from Siman Kuf Samech, Sif Yud Daled, I have Jew number one who loans money Ribbis to Jew number two and says go and pay a non-Jew. That's still considered to be 100% Ribbis, right? So then the reason why this is still going to be a problem is because Jew number one cannot serve as the shliach for the non-Jew. He's really serving two functions as the shliach, a little complicated. He can't serve as the shliach for the non-Jew to be deemed to have received the money back on behalf of the non-Jew and then have reloaned the money on behalf of the non-Jew to Jew number two. He simply can't serve in that role. Why? Because Ein Shlichos L'Akum on a Deraisa level. So therefore, Ein Shlichos L'Akum L'Kula. So it's still considered to be, as far as we're concerned, halachically, Jew number one who's making a loan to Jew number two and is just directing the money to be paid to the non-Jew. This is very much like the proverbial, it's so interesting. This is a case that people still don't get. They can't wrap their heads around. I had a Rav in my community who said he can't wrap his head around this. He doesn't understand why this is us. But this is because it's hard to, because Ribbis is hard. But this is the classic credit card case. Jew number one is borrowing basically from the bank, the non-Jew, and he gives his credit card to Jew number two, use my credit card and go pay the bank. Says, well, what's the problem? The real lender here is the non-Jew. No, the lender's not the non-Jew. The non-Jew didn't even appoint him as a shliach over here. It's not even a question. But certainly this is a manifestation of why this is problematic. This is considered to be Jew number one making a loan to Jew number two and saying direct your interest payments to the credit card company, and that would be 100% usher. This notion that the reason why this idea doesn't work of the non-Jew telling the Jew number one to give the money to Jew number two, and Jew number one will be off the hook, and he directs Jew number two to pay the akum. Why is it no good? Says the Taz, Sifkat and base. What's very helpful in this Siman, I'll tell you two sources that are extremely helpful in terms of learning this Siman. One is the Shach. Shach is always wonderful. Shach is always wonderful. A couple of Shachs that are not muskam the Yoreh Deah over here, but the Shach is always wonderful. And the Hilchos Binyamin. Whoa. Hilchos Binyamin is a wonderful sefer Hilchos Ribbis. One of the great things that Hilchos Binyamin does for you is that he breaks down all the words. He doesn't only go into esoteric discussions of what we glean from this sif or that sif without necessarily giving you an understanding of what the words mean. He tells you what every single word means, what every single case scenario means, gives you a lot of background, sometimes a real lot of background. But Hilchos Binyamin, really wonderful, indispensable source. Really, I think, really opened up this Siman for me, speaking from a personal level. But anyway, the Taz in Sifkat and base says, the Keiman Shekiba Miyada Yisrael, Nira Kenosin Ribbis La'obe Kocham B'shlichusei. So it simply seems like Jew number two is giving Ribbis to the non-Jew. The bottom line is, why is this also? Why is this not allowed? Because there's no Shlichus La'obe Kochavim. Hein Obe Kochavim L'Yisrael. Whether it's a non-Jew appointing a Jew, Hein Lehefek, or a Jew appointing a non-Jew, there's no Shlichus for an Obe Kochavim. Okay, that's principle number 2. Now, principle number 3 teaches me that this concept is actually a double-edged sword. Double-edged sword. You know what that means? It means there's an edge. There's a sword on one end, and then there's a sword on the other edge, right? So although Ein Shlichus La'akum L'Kula, even though we say that there's no Shlichus La'akum L'Kula, nonetheless, we do say that Yesh Shlichus La'akum, that there is agency with respect to an akum le'chumra. That as far as a chumra is concerned, there we do say that there is the possibility of agency with respect to a non-Jew, at least according to Rashi. In fact, according to everybody. That's what the Gemara says. But the question is whether the Havamina of the Gemara survives the Maskana. So Rabbeinu Tam says the Havamina of the Gemara doesn't survive the Maskana. So Rashi says it does. And Rashi's opinion is expressed several times throughout the Siman by the Mechaber, and it's also expressed by the Ramah, but only L'Chatzchila. The Ramah will bring a number of times, Rabbeinu Tam is going to be makel about this, but says that at least L'Chatzchila, if it's not a big shasatrak, one should be machmir like the opinion of Rashi. So how does this play out? So thus, in the corresponding case in Siv Vav, when you have a non-Jew who borrowed from Jew number 1, right? It's the same scenario as Sif Aleph, but in this case, I have a non-Jew who borrowed from Jew number 1, Ribbis. So when Jew number 1 gives over the money to Jew number 2, right? He says, give the money, or like this, Jew number 1 says to the non-Jew, give the money over to Jew number 2 on my behalf, right? So he says to the non-Jew, give the money over to Jew number 2 on my behalf as my shliach. So in this particular case, we say, yesh shlichus la'akum l'chumra. The chumra is considered to be as if Jew number 1 actually is giving the money to Jew number 2 and telling Jew number 2, you're going to have to pay the ribbis going forward. So it's not considered to be as if the non-Jew is giving the money to Jew number 2 and saying, go and pay the Jew, which would be perfectly fine. That's Siv Dalet over here, right? If I have a loan, the Jew takes from a non-Jew, and the non-Jew says, oh, instead of paying me the ribbis, pay this other Jewish fellow. No problem, you could do that, because that's a loan from a non-Jew to a Jew. A non-Jew can direct the money to go anywhere, even to somebody who's Jewish. That's not a problem. But because we say, yesh shlichus legoy l'chumra, it's going to turn out that it's considered as if the original lender, then the Jew number 1, is considered now to have extended this money to, that says, as if he had the akum service, the shliach, to repay him, and then on his behalf to reloan the money to Jew number 2 as an interest-bearing loan, and therefore this is going to also be usher. That is principle number 3. Now, according to Rabbeinu Tam, as we mentioned, that we say, Ein shlichus la'akum bein l'kula bein l'chumra. Okay, that's good. So one can be mekel. So the Ramah says on that basis that there is room to sometimes be mekel. However, so he says, this is in Sivav, ha'ikar kisvara rishona. The main opinion that we follow is the first Sivara, but he says there is room to allow those who are mekel in certain mekomos based on Rabbeinu Tam to continue doing so. Again, as Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik pointed out, there were difficulties in terms of getting around Hilchos Ribbis, and therefore there were places that relied upon certain leniency. So the Ramah says this is not considered to be such a far-fetched leniency. Even according to Rashi, it's only a d'Rabbanan. When we say yesh lichus la'akum l'chumra, that's not a din d'Oraisa, that's a chumra d'Rabbanan. It's a chumra d'Rabbanan. So in extenuating circumstances, there might be room to be mekel even according to Rashi. So Sif Hey is a classic example. If you go to Sif Hey, take a look. Yisrael hilpa le'ovi kochavim b'Ribbis, ve'o kochavim malba osam l'Yisrael b'Ribbis, v'chozer Yisrael harishon menota Ribbis me'ovi kochavim aser. Classic case. Jew number 1 loans money to non-Jew. Non-Jew then loans the money to Jew number 2. Jew number 1 then collects the Ribbis, even if he's collecting it indirectly from the non-Jew, since ultimately it's coming from Jew number 2. Therefore, this is a classic manifestation of Yesh, Shlichos, Le'ovei Kochavim, Le'chumra, right? No question about it. Good? Okay, so this is a case where the Machlokes, Rashi, and Rabbeinu Tam will clearly come into play. But, says the Ramah, that just like I said, there might be room to be mekel sometimes, even according to Rashi, but so too, there are times to be machmir, even according to Rabbeinu Tam. So here the Ramah says that even Rabbeinu Tam would be machmir if Jew number 1 is kafa. He places a lot of pressure. He places pressure. He knows what the line of succession is over here. He knows he loaned the money to the non-Jew, and he knows the non-Jew loaned the money to the Jew. He knows what's going on. So what does he do? He puts a lot of pressure on the non-Jew to pay him back, and he knows that if he's going to put the pressure on the non-Jew, what's the non-Jew going to do? He's going to put the pressure, he's going to put the chokehold on Jew number 2, right? So therefore, since that's what's going on over here, this is considered to be much more of a subterfuge. Even from the perspective of Rabbeinu Tam, we would say this is a case where it's quite clear that Jew number 1 is relying upon Jew number 2. And this is not just simply shlichus. The more that it's clear that the non-Jew in the middle is not playing much of a role, is maybe just a very beleaguered mail carrier, shall we say, that we're going to be more likely to be machmir. However, if the non-Jew has a mashkon from Jew number 2 that he can rely upon, so that he doesn't have to worry about whether he's going to be able to collect his debt. So in such a case, then we have room to be mekel. That's what the Ramah says in Sif Hey. Aval im islay the ovikachar mashkam Yisrael sheni shein sarach la'kufo. So he's not going to have to pressure him terribly. And the Shach says even if it would have been b'shlichus shel Yisrael according to Rabbeinu Tam, so then it's going to be permissible in that case. But we see that we have to take a look, even according to Rabbeinu Tam, as to what degree there's some sort of a distance, shall we say, between Jew number 1 and Jew number 2 when you have a non-Jew in the middle. This brings us now to principle number 4. And remember here what was introduced at the end of principle number 3 was how a mashkon can make a difference. And it's important to understand that the mashkon is going to be a very important pawn in this game. Okay, no pun intended, of course, but the mashkon is going to be a very important pawn in, both in terms of how we're going to have all of these, understand the application of all of these principles, because a mashkon itself can assume an identity of one of the parties, as we shall see. Now, principle number 4, if there is no actual shlichus, then the Chumrah of Rashi doesn't apply. That's what I was mentioning briefly in passing before. If the non-Jew is simply, if you have a case where you have a separate loan, which is entirely from the non-Jew to Jew number 2, that's not at all directed by Jew number 1, so then it's going to be heter gomor, even for Jew number 2 to pay Jew number 1, and this is not going to be a problem of shlichus, because there was no direction by Jew number 1 for the non-Jew who borrowed from him to lend to anybody in particular. They're considered to be two separate and distinct loans. And how are we going to know that they're two separate and distinct loans? Sometimes the Meforshim will look at whether it was much later in time, for example, that in January, Jew number 1 makes a Ribbis bearing loan to the non-Jew, and then in December the non-Jew makes a loan of an equivalent amount of money to Jew number 2. So we're going to say that if the non-Jew says to Jew number 2, oh, it would be convenient for me if instead of paying me, I happen to owe money to Jew number 1, you'll pay Jew number 1 instead. There was never any kind of loan even through shlichus. There was no shlichus over here. There was no explicit instruction from Jew number 1 to the non-Jew going to extend a loan to Jew number 2, and there's nothing suspicious because didn't happen. Take it from Miyad, didn't happen the same day. So that's going to be permissible even according to Rashi. Well, let's say that I have a situation where the non-Jew extended a loan to Jew number 1. Jew number 1 paid back the non-Jew. The non-Jew said, put the money down and you're off the hook. And then the non-Jew picks up the money and he lends it out to Jew number 2, right? So those are the cases that we have in Sif Beis, we have in Sif Gimel. Those are cases that are going to be perfectly fine. Look at Sif Beis. So in Kibel Ovik Kocharim Mos Miyad Yisrael Rishon V'Nasan L'Sheni Mutter. That's going to be completely mutter because the Jew number 1 in that particular case is going to be completely going to be completely out of the picture. You take a look, the Shach in Sif Katan Sif Katan Yud Beis. The Shach in Sif Katan Yud Beis, he articulates the basic principle. There's a question whether in the context of where the Shach articulates this principle, in Sif Katan Yud Beis, which is in Sif Hey, whether it's germane to where he articulates it. That's a discussion of Rabbi Akiva Eger, but we'll focus on the words of the Shach. He says, that there's never going to be a problem unless it was done through shlichos. If there is no shlichos, so then there is nothing to worry about. It's only in a situation of shlichos that you really have to worry. He was saying that within Rabbeinu Tam, but that's the basic rule is, if there's no shlichos, so then all of this entire machlokes doesn't get off the ground. This certainly, to give you an obvious application of this, look at Sivches. Sivches, Yisrael Shamal Ovi Kochavim, Lava Li Min Ovi Kochavim Ribbis. I have Jew number 2 who wants to be a borrower, and he says to the Gentile, to the non-Jewish lender, or the non-Jewish middleman, I should say, go and obtain a loan for me from a different non-Jew, and then this non-Jew instead obtains a loan for him, Yisrael, from Jew number 1. The Ribbis, an interest-bearing loan. This is going to be mutter. Why is it mutter? It's going to be mutter because of the fact that the privity that Jew number 2 had was simply with the middleman, with the non-Jew who's getting the money for him, right? He's saying, you make me the loan and get the funds from a certain non-Jew, and then the non-Jew obtain the funds from Jew number 1. Jew number 1 has no privity with Jew number 2, and in fact, that the non-Jew is not performing an act of shlichus that I'm going to say, yesh shlichus la'akam l'chumra. Why is that? Because if he would be a shliach, he'd be shliach sheshina b'shlichuso. He'd be a shliach who messed up his shlichus. He was supposed to obtain a loan from a non-Jew. Instead, he obtained it from a Jew. So even Rashi would hold that this is 100% mutter. But Haraya, the Mechaber, always paskins like Rashi, paskins that this is perfectly okay. Similarly, in Siv Zayin, even Rashi would agree that there's no chumrah from the standpoint of the Malveh when he didn't know he's giving a loan to a non-Jew. And then it turned out that that he didn't know that the non-Jew. Or let's look at it this way: that I had a malveh who's making a loan to a he's making a loan in Sif Zayin Yisrael She'amal Ovi Kochavim Lovely most Ribbis mi Yisrael. So as far as the Jewish lender is concerned, he thinks he's making a loan to a non-Jew. And then it turns out that the non-Jew who is borrowing from him, from Jew number 1, the non-Jew passes on the funds to Jew number 2. So the Jew number 2 was the ultimate borrower. Not only that, but the non-Jew always had in mind, that he is going to borrow the funds on behalf of this Jew number 2 borrower. But he didn't tell the lender. So the lender didn't know. The lender was in the dark. He thought he's making a perfectly legitimate interest-bearing loan to non-Jew, right? And then it turns out, what do you know? The money was given by the non-Jew to a Jew. So in this case, everybody would agree that while the Lovet did an Isser, the Lovet did something wrong, but the Malva is allowed to collect the money. Even according to Rashi, the Chumrah of Yesh Shlichus, remember, it's only a Chumrah, otherwise we can't be making it. So it's because it's only a Chumrah to say Yesh Shlichus la'akum the Chumrah. So in this case, we're not going to impose that Chumrah on the Malva. We didn't do anything wrong. He thought he's making a perfectly legitimate interest-bearing loan to the non-Jew. So therefore, he's allowed to collect the money. So we see that sometimes that can work even according to Rashi when there is no malfeasance on the part of the Jewish lender who would ultimately be collecting the money. That is Sif Zayin. Okay. Now, this brings us to principle number 5, which is the flip side of the equation. What's the flip side of the equation? Like this. Namely, even according to Shitas Rabbeinu Tam, we have a problem, as I've mentioned, when the non-Jew is doing, we're not talking about shlichus, and we're not talking about a case where there is a real substantive role that's being played, but just not b'torah shlichus. But let's say that the Nachri is doing what I called before the Ma'aseh Kof. He's the mail carrier. So he's only a mail carrier of an interest-bearing loan from Jew number 1 to Jew number 2, right? So in such a case, even according to Rabbeinu Tam, that's not a shlichus. That's not a shlichus. Of course, that's a nothing. That's a gornished. So you'll say, what do you mean it's a gornished? How could it be a gornished? Didn't we learn the Shuvas Rashi in Siman Kuf Samach? We said even with a Jew, you can get out of problems, right? Because you have Ein Shliach D'var Avera, where's a Jew who can be a Shliach. So why, if it's only a Ma'aseh Kof and it doesn't mean anything, so why, according to the Shuvas Rashi, are you going to be in good shape? And the Ramah even paskins this way, although nobody else in the world does. But he says that you would be, the later Meforshim say, it was a Talmud Torah. Talmud Torah. We wrote this in the name of Rashi, right? That if the Jewish lender gives the money to the Jewish middleman, and the Jewish middleman then loans out the money to Jew number 2, and then Jew number 2 can pay Ribbis through the Jewish middleman to Jew number 1, because it's not Ribbis Haba Milova L'Malveh, because you have the middleman. So anyway, if a Ma'aseh Kof means that it's just considered to be going directly, that's what we're going to say over here, and according to Rabbeinu Tam, that it's going to be considered like it's going directly from Jew number 1 to Jew number 2, and we don't pay any attention to the Akim in the middle if he bears no responsibility ever whatsoever for the transaction, is just a mail carrier. So why then, how do we understand that case of Rashi? So I have a couple of answers for you. One, and there's a reason we say it was a Talmud Torah, right? The other answer is that the Meforshim explain, no, in that case the middleman was doing more than a Ma'aseh Kof. He was taking a Hava of Keren. He was taking a Hava of Keren without Ribbis from the original Jewish Malveh, and then he was extending a Hava of only Keren between himself and Jew number 2, but it's just that Jew number 2 had to pay the Ribbis to Jew number 1. That was sort of transmitted in the mix. And it was almost like a premium being paid in order for the loan to take place. So therefore, it's not a contradiction of this principle. The Shach notes. What? Why would you need shlichus? That's a whole discussion in Siman Kuf Sam. But the point that I wanted to get to over here is that it's not a contradiction to the notion that if I would have a Ma'aseh Kof B'Alma, that even that case would not be permitted. Even those who are making in that case would not permit it if it would be a Ma'aseh Kof B'Alma. Now the Shach notes this in Sif Chav Daled, where the Shach says in Sif Katan Ayin Gimel, where the Shach says explicitly that this type of case would be Ribbis Ketzutza. What's the case over there? in Sif Chav Daled. So that is the case of a money manager, right? Nobody disagrees with this principle that if you had a Jew who was loaning out money and he used the non-Jew in the middle as his money manager, his apotropos, right? And the non-Jew doesn't bear any personal achrayos. He's just lending out the Jew's money, and the Jew bears all the achrayos for the money. So it says, Asa lilbos mimenu b'ribbis, that it's going to be 100% Asa, says the Shach. And you know what? Asa Ribbis Ketzutzu. And it's Ribbis Ketzutzu. This isn't just a Chum Rabbi Amma. This is Ribbis Ketzutzu. Why? According to Rabbeinu Tam, why doesn't the Ramah have a footnote over here saying that this is a shlichus, and we say ain't shlichus la'akum afilu l'chumra? So the answer is that he's just a ma'aseh kof in terms of managing, but he doesn't have any the kind of achrayus whatsoever. It's not considered to be as an employee. That's not considered to be as if it left the rishus of a Jew number one altogether. There's a bit of a kasha. There's a bit of a kasha in Sif Chav Aleph, because Sif Chav Aleph seems to indicate that when the non-Jew is bearing achrayus, we are maker. Let's take a look at Sif Chav Aleph over here. It says that im ma'osav shel Yisrael mufkadim biyad ovi kochavim. If I have a Jewish money that is in the hands of a non-Jew, v'hilvosam b'Yisrael b'Ribbis, and now he loaned it to a Jew b'Ribbis, so im hayu b'achrayas ovi kochavim, if the ovi kochavim did bear achrayas, so mutar likach Ribbis. So then it would be permissible for the Jew number one to accept the Ribbis. Why would it be acceptable in such a case? Here, with the ovi kochavim is bearing some level of achrayas, at the very least, we would view him as a shliach, right? So maybe we should say ain't shlichus, because the whole point over here is that we want this to be like a good shlichus, right? So why don't we say that ain't shlichus la'akum, in order for this still to be considered to be the money of the Jew that's being loaned out directly to the non-Jew. So there are different answers that are given to this kasha. And one answer is that there was no command in this case. When the Jew gave the money over to the non-Jew, he didn't command the non-Jew to loan the money to Jew number two in this particular case. So therefore, this is considered to be like your Sif Zayin scenario, where it would be a loan from Jew number one to the non-Jew, and the non-Jew turns around and he makes a separate standalone loan to Jew number two, right? Because of the fact that there was no command in this case, or that this could be a case where the loan was made at a much later point in time. But anyway, a clear result would be that if I had my Sif Zayin case, and the non-Jew in the middle said to Jew number one, lend to me for the sake of Jew number two, and he's not taking any kind of achrayus whatsoever, so then it's clear that this should be Ribbis Ketzutza. It's clear that this should be Ribbis Ketzutza because it's a ma'aseh kof b'alma, even according to Rabbeinu Tam. Giving all of the Kollel of Siman Kof Ayin, as I'm explaining, is the difference between shlichus on the one hand and ma'aseh kof b'alma on the other hand. So if he's just a mail deliverer of the loan, so then it's considered to be a direct loan, even according to Rabbeinu Tam, from Jew number one to Jew number two. Rabbi Reisman in his Sefer says the same would be true if you had a court-appointed trustee. It was a non-Jew who was a court-appointed trustee for a Jew's assets, and he goes and he starts lending out the money to other Jews. This would be Ribbis Gomer, because the only liability that the non-Jew has is for gross negligence. But otherwise, the achrayus is all still still remains with Jew number one, and therefore this would be like your mail carrier case, where essentially he's just like the money manager that we speak about in Sif Chav Daled, and this would be problematic. Fine. So that's principle number 5. Now this in turn is a springboard. This question of who's being relied upon. At the end of the day, who's the real party in interest, is a springboard for some of the more complicated applications in Siman Kuf Samach Ches to Kuf Samach Tes. So just as background, in Siman this is important. There's one Siman that ties in very, very intimately with Siman Kuf Samach Ches, Kuf Samach Tes, and maybe because it's the adjacent neighbor, and that's Siman Kuf Ayin. especially the very beginning of Kuf Ayin, that speaks about Orev situations, guarantor situations. And in Siman Kuf Ayin, we learn a very important principle, two principles. Number one, Jew number two, we'll call him Jew number two, he may not serve as an Orev Kablon for a loan from Jew number one to a non-Jew, because it's then considered as if Jew number two borrowed directly from Jew number one, because Jew number one can turn to him first to collect the Ribbis. That's what Orev Kabbalah means. If he be an Orev Stam, and Jew number one first has to go to the non-Jew before he can collect from Jew number two, so that's permissible, because whatever accrues only accrued at the very, very end, after he first went to non-Jew, and therefore it's not a Ribbis, the bearing obligation from the perspective of the Orev, because an Orev Stam. But if it's an Orev Kabbalah, so that's going to be usher. That's going to be also the Yoreh Deah. This is Machlokas Rashi and Rashba about with respect to serving as an Orev Kabbalah from a loan from a non-Jew to Jew number one. If Jew number two can serve as an Orev Kabbalah or not, we're machmir that he can't serve as an Orev Kabbalah. But certainly in this case, where a Jew is loaning to a non-Jew, and then Jew number two is serving as an Orev Kabbalah, everybody agrees that would be usher. So this creates an interesting result in Siftes, which is that sometimes I can have a mashkon, create a mashkon that belongs to a Jew, serve as his stand-in, so that he's still considered to be in the picture as an Orev Kabbalah. So if I have a loan from a Jew to a non-Jew, and it looks like everything's honky-dory because it's just a loan from a Jew to a non-Jew, but there's this mashkon hovering around that originated with Jew number two, who had this relationship with the non-Jew who made a loan to Jew number two, so that mashkon might be considered to be like Jew number two is still in the picture as an Orev Kabbalah, and then I have a prohibited Ribbis transaction in such a case, right? So that's basically what I have. That's the case in Siftes, and the only time, and this is the way the Shach and the Taz explain it, and I don't have the wherewithal to explain it according to other Rachmanim, so as I said, we stick with the Shach for the most part. So the way that the Shach understands the scenario over there is that it all depends upon whether hiknehu, did the mashkon remain in the possession of Jew number two, or when Jew number two was giving the mashkon over to the non-Jew, who is what we call the non-Jew akum in the middle, did he have in mind either that he's going to hold on to it, or that he's planning to be makne the mashkon, that it should belong squarely and completely to the Jew, to the non-Jew in the middle. So if the Jew number two, when he gave over the mashkon to the akum in the middle, had in mind that it should now be in the possession of the akum in the middle, so then I don't have a mashkon of a Jew as an Orev Kabbalah anymore. But if he didn't have in mind to be makne to him, so then I have a problem. So certainly in Sif Yud I'm going to have a problem, because in Sif Yud the non-Jew was kind of getting angry at the Jew and said, hey, where's my money? I'm taking this mashkon from you. And he didn't wait for the Jew to offer him the mashkon as part of the transaction. He grabbed the mashkon from him. So there for sure, we know that he wasn't makne in the mashkon. And then I'm going to have a problem. I'm certainly going to have a problem, according to Rashi, I'm going to have a problem in such a case. According to Rabbeinu Tam, Mistam, I should have a problem in such a case as well. The Hilchos B'Yamin gives some sort of an explanation, because the Meforshim seem to indicate you're not going to have a problem according to Rabbeinu Tam. Says, yeah, because once there's no shlichus, so the akum, the chumrah, so then the fact that Jew number two was never had privity with Jew number one, it was a separate loan transaction to Jew number two, so therefore we don't pay attention to the fact that the mashkon still belongs to the Jew, because it has nothing to do with Jew number one and his transaction. Sort of a shver teretz, but he has to give some sort of a teretz. But with respect to the case in the Siftes where the mashkon was given willingly, so we say at least according to Rashi, we're going to assume that it's going to be a problem that I have an Orev Kabbalah in the picture, and the assumption is that I have to be worried that the Jew number two was not makne his mashkon to the non-Jew. According to Rabbeinu Tam, that we assume that Ein Shlichus La'akum, so part of the Ein Shlichus La'akum assumption is going to be that he was makne the mashkon, but that we see that if I did have a mashkon in the picture that still belonged to the Jew, and I didn't have this Ein Shlichus the Akum L'chumra dispensation of Rabbeinu Tam, which we don't rely upon, certainly L'chatchila, so then we do have a problem whenever there is a Jewish mashkon in the picture of as the Jew still being involved as an Orev Kabbalah, when it comes to the transaction. And this helps us understand as well Sif Yud Aleph, because in Sif Yud Aleph's case, we know that Jew number 2 was certainly planning to just give over his mashkon to the non-Jew, for the non-Jew to be able to use it to borrow money from, because he was only mashil it to him. In that case, he was mashil a chayfetz to him. Not that he borrowed any money from him, he's mashil a chayfetz. So then we assume that he's doing it as a big favor to him, and of course he has in mind to be makneh it. So that's why in that case the Mechaber, who always follows Rashi, says mutar l'Yisrael lahavos l'ovikacham Allah b'Ribbis, and that's going to be perfectly permissible. Now again, what ended up happening in Sif Tes is that you had this convoluted case where the Ovei Kochavim, the non-Jew, borrowed from a Jew, Ribbis, and he had used this mashkon. So the question was that then Jew number 2 only came along afterwards and claimed that it was his mashkon. So we said that the Malved doesn't have to believe him in such a case. However, if he knows that the mashkon belonged to a Jew, that's really the problematic case. So then we said he has to be machmir about it. And the Ramah says that this is only according to the opinion that said that the opinion of Rashi, the yesh shlichus le'ovei kochavim l'chumrah, but otherwise, according to Rabbeinu Tam, it's going to be permissible. Why is it going to be permissible? So the Shach says, because we would assume that that at least according to Rabbeinu Tam, we're always going to assume that since there never can be any privity between Jew number 1 and Jew number 2 when there's a non-Jew in the middle, that of course the non-Jew had in mind to be makneh his mashkon to the non-Jew, and therefore it doesn't belong to the Jew anymore. So this is just an important principle in terms of understanding the role of the mashkon. Now, along these lines, moving on to principle number 7. Yes, Ike.
What type of kinyan was in the is showing that you're doing makneh? Jew number 2 is makneh the mashkon. What type? Mashicha. Is it as a matana, or it's a mashkon, but Torah's mashkon for all?
The Torah's mashkon, but it doesn't matter. But it's leaving his possession.
And what would we have assumed otherwise? Why is that such a critical thing that the Rishonim are all discussing here, to make sure that you're actually back down? We don't necessarily assume it until the Reiss says we assume if it's just a mashkon, it's mashkon. That's what every halva with the mashkon is. So why would we have to result to any principles if that's what we're assuming?
I guess that there are 2 different ways. You can give over a mashkon that until such time as it's redeemed, it really belongs to you. It really belongs to you until such time as it says it's redeemed, and you might have the right even to sell it, at which point in time you're responsible to pay me the value or something like that. Okay, that's what we're talking about over here. Or, no, you're basically a shomer on my mashkon, that I'm allowing you to hold it as a security in case you're going to need to use it, but I'm not really giving it to you to be able to sell, do whatever you want with it.
One of them is, like, let's say, the Guvina was given over, like a potiki.
At the end of the day, the person who's holding the mashkon is still going to be responsible to return the value in the event that the loan is ever paid back. Okay, so if let's say it was worth more than the loan, they'll still have to pay back the value at that point in time. But the only question is, do they have complete ownership control over it while it's in their possession to be able to do with it what they want? Because we have one of the case scenarios here is where the person actually, the non-Jew actually even sold the mashkon while it was in his possession. So that's a question. And then the question is that the non-Jew wants to, he doesn't have possession of the Jewish purchaser. How much money does he have to pay in order to get that mashkon that he purchased from the non-Jew, which is sitting in the Jew's possession? So it does have nafkaminas, I think, to that degree. Okay, now along these lines, what's principle number 7? Principle number 7 is that the mashkon is serving as the relied upon collateral can also serve as a possible kula. It can also serve as a possible leniency when Jew number 1 lends to a non-Jew through a shliach. Okay, who's the shliach? Shliach is Jew number 2. That's no problem. A Jew number 1 can utilize Jew number 2 to be his shliach. Yesh shlichus liYisrael. That's good, right? Okay. So, but the thing is that sometimes the shliach does a little bit too much. Like in Sif Yudalid, we talk about where a shliach is prepared to undertake to be responsible for the payment of the loan in case the non-Jew doesn't. That's called an arev. An arev, he's going to guarantee. Guaranteeing is okay. If it's an arev stam is all right. But what if he guarantees to be an arev kablan? So the Shach talks about this. He says, yeah, that practice resulted. This is the Shach, very important Shach, Sifkot and Memtes, where he talks about this possibility of serving as an Arav Kablan in this type of situation. So really, normally you can't serve as an Arav Kablan. But what if there's a mashkon in the picture? Well, that's Siman Kufayin. And Siv Beis says if there's a mashkon in the picture, so then it would be okay to serve as an Arav Kablan, right? But not really, because that might only be with a Keren, it might only be with a Ribbis, not both. If you read the Meforshim, it's not as clear as what the Ramah seems to indicate. But here the Shach says that the practice seems to have developed that even if the Jew who's the middle person in this loan, where Jew number one is ultimately lending to a non-Jew, and Jew number two is the one in the middle, he's the shliach, and he says, oh, don't worry about it, I'll take care of the Keren Ribbis. Now, the Shach admits that this is why we have the Lashon, we call Malcolm the Chatchila. You're not allowed to do this. That's what the Ramah is, the Lashon Lechatchila, mean Lechatchila. Sometimes Lechatchila means that don't do it in the first instance, but we'll let you get away with it. But sometimes it means something else. Lechatchila here means mitchila. Mitchila, he certainly couldn't be the borrower. And the loan couldn't be for the purpose of Jew number two. And he says, don't worry, I'll take care of the Keren Ribbis. I don't care how good a mashkon you have in that situation, that's going to be an Issa Gomer of Ribbis. So it means mitchila, the purpose of the loan has to be for the Gentile, for the non-Jew at the end of the line. But the Jews, the Shliach, can say, oh, but don't worry, I'll take care of the Keren Ribbis. Not only that, it says the Shach, the practice developed that this would also be done even to serve as an Arav Kablan. So he says, wait a second, how can such a thing be allowed? So he says, Mi orisi noagim ma'avim mekom sheyisom b'shasol bashi parakem v'ribis v'nirili desvile d'davka hechashen amashkan tov lahavos alav sachal ba sheyishaver hakerem v'ribis sheyagi alav. So he says that maybe it's only a problem if the mashkon is not going to be valuable enough that it would be able to cover all of the Keren and all of the Ribbis for the entire term of the loan. You have a 30-year mortgage loan. So you have to have a pretty expensive mashkon. Even if you have a house that you're lending upon, the house is probably going to be enough to cover the principal, not going to be enough to cover all the principal and all the interest. But if you have such a gevaldige mashkon that's going to be that valuable, he says, afilu ya'amad zaman och, she'az nira she'smicha samav el yisoba kai gamna. So he says that as long as you have this type of a situation, he says that maybe it's only usher if the mashkon is ein tov lahavos alav sachalva. But if it is tov lahavos alav sachalva, so then you'll be allowed to do this. Now he says mikol makom yesh li zoya b'zeh. He's not thrilled about this particular kula, but he says that sometimes if you have a really valuable mashkon, it can turn the commitment of the Jew that sounds like a commitment of Arav Kablan into effectively an Arav Stam. It's not that we're permitting him to be an Arav Kablan, but it makes him more into an Arav Stam because what's really being relied upon is the mashkon. But if it's clear that the Jew number two is really an Arav Kablan, or even that he's acting as a loves, so this solution doesn't help. So if I had a non-Jew as a lender, okay, and this is the Hilchos Binyamin gives this example. I have a non-Jew as a lender, and Jew number one takes a mortgage loan on behalf of Jew number two, whose property really is serving as the main mashkon over here, says this is still going to be usher because number one, Jew number one is certainly being relied upon by the non-Jew because he's the named borrower of the mortgage loan. So he's at least being relied upon as an Arav Kablan, and I would venture to say he's being relied upon as the actual borrower. So here, it doesn't matter if the house that is being used as the mashkon is the most valuable piece of real estate that you can imagine, nonetheless, it's still going to be usher in that situation. Okay, so that's principle number 7. Now we're up to principle number 8. I only have 10, so not so much long. Principle number 8. There's also a kula when the Jew in the middle is clearly only a carrier pigeon, such as in Sif Yud Gimel, where I have a Jew in the middle, and then I have a non-Jew loaning to a Jew, or a Jew loaning to a non-Jew, but the Jew in the middle is only a carrier pigeon. So that's the case that we mentioned in Sif Yud Gimel with all the bells and whistles, that the Jew in the middle is not assuming any responsibilities. If it's clear that Jew number one knows to only rely upon the borrower. So the consequences of this assumption are spelled out in Sif Tes above. So Sif Tes above makes it very clear that if I had a Jew who loaned from a Jew, but it was not for his purposes, but it was for the purpose of the non-Jew, and as a result, the non-Jew gave a mashkon that the Jewish lender is relying upon. Now, Jew number 2 says, well, don't sell the mashkon, because it turns out that the non-Jew is not paying back. He's what we call an olam. He's a strong man, a gangster, and he's not paying back. We have the strong man situation emerge a few times in the Siman. So it says the Malveh is not obligated to listen to him because of the fact that he has no obligations. He has no obligations with respect to the shliach in this case, because the shliach is simply a middleman. It's not his mashko, not his business. Especially if he wasn't retained in the first place by Jew number 1. Sif Yud Zayin spells out the flip case scenario in Sif Yud Zayin, where I have a loan from non-Jew to Jew number 2, and Jew number 1 is only considered to be the carrier pigeon. In this case, Yisrael she Amar L'Chavero Lovely most me'ovi kocharim. The Jew number 2 says the Jew number 1 borrows some money from me from the non-Jew. If the non-Jew understands that he only has the rights to the mashkon and he has no claim with respect to Jew number 1, or where Jew number 1 has spelled out to him the name of Jew number 2, and he knows that he's relying only upon Jew number 2 and not upon Jew number 1. So either he's relying upon the mashkon, or he's relying upon the fact that he knows the identity of a Jew number of Jew number 2, or Jew number 1 walked him over to Jew number 2. So then it would be mutter. Then it would be permissible in those circumstances for Jew number 1 to serve as the middleman to collect the interest from Jew number 2 and to pay the interest over to the non-Jew. So you have this qualifications are spelled out that it has to be clear that the non-Jew knows that he's relying upon only Jew number 2. He says that, for example, Amalo Lavali Mos Ribbis Meovi Kocharim Ashmi, that if there would be no mashkom, then it has to be spelled out that the non-Jew knows that he's only making the loan for Jew number 2. And the non-Jew believed him. I don't know how we make the assessment that the non-Jew believed him, but there are different, we assume that that's taken care of. Maybe he wrote a star to that effect, and he's relying upon the lov, and he's not relying upon the shliach. So that also is going to be like the carrier pigeon case. And so too in all these apotropos situations, where it's known that you have a Jewish money manager who's basically loaning out the non-Jews money. So even though it looks like the Jew is making an interest-bearing loan to other Jews, it's perfectly permissible. If it's not known that he's the money manager, so then it could be a Mari Zion issue, but otherwise it would be perfectly permissible. Yes, Ike?
If Husdas has he trusts him when he gives him the name of the Jew that he's lending to. That detail, if he doesn't give him a name, he just tells him, I'm lending to another Jew without stam, he doesn't trust him.
Right. He has to say, he has to say Al Shemi. It says you have to give the name. Right.
Then he tries.
Yeah, exactly. Now, principle number 9, the other very important issue that's explained in this siman is the ability to collect interest when either the Jew paying it was never a borrower, as in Sif Yud Daled, where we see in Sif Yud Daled the Jew was never the borrower. That's where Yisrael Shalava me Chavero l'tzarach ovi kochavim v'kasavim ovi kochavim la Ribbis b'yoker v'Yisrael amal b'pacha kasav b'pachos. So I have a Jew number 1 who's making a loan to the non-Jew. Jew number 2 is processing the loan. He's collecting an extra fee from the non-Jew. And what gives him the right to collect an extra fee? That's called schar sasaros. He's getting a brokerage fee. No problem in that particular case. But he certainly has no obligation to Jew number 1 if the loan is only coming from Jew number 1 to the borrower. So if I have a strong man over Kacharm in this case, and he doesn't want to pay, so it can't be that the Jew is going to be responsible under these circumstances. And of course, this is where the Shach spoke about that he could be an Arav Stam, but he can't be an Arav Kaplan, and that's where we speak about what about if the mashkon is worth more money. But he was never a borrower. Or if the one who's collecting the money was never a lender, that's also going to be okay. And that's the complicated scenario that we have in Sif Yudches, or in the Dr. Soloveitchik pictures, the porn case that you can, look at. You want to pass it around if you want to take a look at the drawings. It's worthwhile. And then you want to make copies of it, I guess you can. I don't know if there's copyright issues, whatever. But you'll see. But in any event, the scenario there, which seems to have been one of the more complicated devices that was used, is that you had a loan that was from Jew number one to a Gentile, and then the Gentile gave over a mashkon to Jew number one, and Jew number one would sell the mashkon to Jew number two. So Jew number two was never a lender. He simply was buying. He simply was buying the mashkon. But how do you buy a mashkon? You pay money. So he's paying money to Jew number one. And then at some point in time, Jew number one is going to redeem the mashkon. He's going to redeem the mashkon with what it's worth, because when he's selling the mashkon, he's still selling the mashkon all the rights that accrue together with the mashkon, meaning all the rights of the loan of being able to collect money from the loan that was originally extended from Jew number one to the Gentile. So you have all of this ribbis, this new interest which is accruing. At a certain point in time, Jew number one wants to buy back the mashkon. He's going to pay extra money for all of the additional value that now the mashkon is worth because of all the accrued interest on the loan that it represents, right? In the mashkon lichtachov, whatever. So now he's going to be able to, so now it's going to be worth a lot more money, and he pays that extra money. So when you think about it, what happened over here? Jew number two paid money to Jew number one, and Jew number two got back a lot more money from Jew number one, corresponding to all of the interest that was accruing on the loan. Why is this permissible? So a very simple answer: because it's not a loan, it's a sale. But in order for it to be a sale, it has to be a genuine sale. If there's a guaranteed buyback, so that generally is not going to be good. There seemed to be some sort of a practice at one point in time that allowed for a guaranteed buyback, and the Shach gives some sort of a very convoluted explanation that nobody accepts. So let's just ignore that for the moment, about whether the mashkon was actually, this is also getting back to hikneu, whether the mashkon was actually transferred by the non-Jew to the Jew's possession or not. If it wasn't, so it makes it better. It doesn't work so well. But the general assumption is that there wasn't really an obligation for the buyback to take place. And because of that, since it wasn't a guaranteed buyback, it'd be a guaranteed buyback. It'd be like selling a field with a guaranteed buyback where the person who's holding the field is not allowed to eat the fruit of the field, because that would be considered to be like ribbis. So that would be a problem, because it would turn out that the whole transaction was ribbis because of but you can have a gentleman's agreement. A gentleman's agreement, you could have a wink, and you could have as many winks and nods as you want. Winks and nods are fine. As long as they're not enforceable winks and nods, you can have a zillion winks and nods. It seems like they had a zillion winks and nods in terms of how they did their transaction in those days. But that was considered to be an acceptable, perfectly permissible transaction. And this is how this is how it was performed. So you make it go through a seller as long as there is no buyback obligation. So then that would not be a ribbis problem. So this is again another very important principle of the SIF, that if you do have a situation where money is being paid, again, the starting principle was if the money is being paid, if the real lender is a non-Jew or the real borrower is a non-Jew, so then you're okay. But now here you're in better shape. You're giving extra money to a Jew who gave you money. You're giving back more money. Are you ever allowed to do that? Yes. If he's a seller, you're allowed to do it. If he's a seller, and that you simply have that the Jew number one bought the mashkon, and now Jew number one of his own volition and out of the kindness of his heart decides that he's going to sell back the mashkon, and he's getting some extra money for the deal because the mashkon is now worth more. No problem, and that's perfectly permissible. So nowadays we don't have this type of sif yud ches scenario anymore. And the reason that we don't have it is, and again, it has to be real, that the seller is not allowed to maintain any responsibility for the payment of the underlying debt, which was represented by the mashkon. So when the seller, Jew number one, sells it to Jew number two, and now the non-Jew is going to stop paying his payments, Jew number one is not allowed to bear any responsibility whatsoever. And this is also why we have in Sif Yutes that it spells out that there has to also be sale language. It can't be that the Jew number one says to Jew number two, oh, loan me the money. So it can't be. Even so the post can talk about maybe if you use a lashon loan, everybody knows that it means to sell. So you could do it, but you can't start with the word loan. You say, I have this mashkon, and now let's do this this transaction that looks like a loan. But if you start with Haveni Maos al Mashkonos, so it says you have to says the Shulchan Aruch and Sif Yotes, then you're going too far. So you have to be very, very careful about how you do it. So we avoid these convoluted situations nowadays by just doing convoluted heteriscus nowadays, so that we avoid altogether this entire predicament. Now, finally, principle number 10 is simply to articulate that this siman has additional. It's a principle that there are additional principles, meaning that these are the 9 major principles that really, and I summarized it on your source sheet if you want to review them, that essentially conceptualize what the major points are of this particular siman in terms of understanding the yesodos, the foundations of Hilchos Ribbis that are manifested in this siman. But there are other nuggets that can be extracted when one looks very closely at the siman of other things that you can pick up in terms of this siman. So I'll just mention in passing that I think that there are other situations, for example, that one can learn practical halacha l'maisa situations from certain things in the siman, like even with respect to security deposits. So that when we spoke about principle number 8, and we spoke about when there's a kula, when the Jew in the middle is clearly only a carrier pigeon. So this, which emerges from Sif Yud Gimel, has 2 important applications of really very common situations. One is a security deposit situation when Jew number 1, the tenant is the lender, and the non-Jewish bank is the ultimate borrower that's going to have the security deposit between a tenant and a landlord sitting in a particular account. Jew number 2, who receives the security deposit that's supposed to be placed in a standalone bank account, is the shaliach, essentially. So that's perfectly fine. If the landlord has no access to the money and he has no achrayas over the money, then this is going to be okay. But if he intermingles that money with his own account, or he's going to actually utilize the money, have achrayas over the money, then that's not going to be okay. Another common scenario is where you have parents who have their kids' money and they put their kids' money in the bank. So do they have, and that money is earning interest in the bank. So this is a question because the parents effectively, by taking the money, really, they could be a shliach or they could be a borrower. What's going to be, how are we going to tell whether they're a shliach, whether they're a borrower? If they're a borrower, so then if they're going to take that ribbis and give it to their kids, so then that's going to be a problem. How can we see whether they're a borrower or not? So the question is, are they utilizing that money? Sometimes parents, they're a little bit short in paying the tuition bills or whatever, and they moreh heter to borrow some money, right, from their kids' account. So you can't do that because then the money that's sitting, if they become a real borrower, so then the ribbis that accrues is going to be problematic to be paid to the kids. So these are just some of the things that emerge. But then there are some other general principles that I enumerated, and I'll just go through them very, very quickly to conclude the discussion. And that is number 1. We find in the siman discussion regarding, and this is in Sif Yud Zayin, ribbis for tzedakah purposes. You have the manhigei akahal case, and this is going to be important. Yetz Hashem, we can have chaburahs in the future about borrowing money for tzorach mitzvah. When is it allowed to be beribbis? And that the Ramah has some sort of a heter, manhigei kahal, are borrowing money from non-Jews, and they're going to give the money to the kehillah, and then the kehillah is going to pay them back beribbis to be paid back to the non-Jew beribbis. Very, very difficult heter in this case, because while you're allowed to borrow money l'tzorach mitzvah for ribbis d'Rabbanan, this appears to be ribbis d'Oraisa, and also you're not necessarily allowed to borrow money for ribbis for mitzvah purposes. It could be you're allowed to loan money for mitzvah purposes, and here it's borrowing the money for mitzvah purposes. So that also beribbis, and that also makes it questionable. But there is a side point which is made in the Piskei Tshuva over here, that if you have people who are hired by the community, let's say not to borrow money and lend money, but to do a big construction project, and in the course, and then to recoup their expenses, and part of their expenses is that they have to borrow money from various banks and institutions in order to have the requisite capital for their construction project. So that can be reimbursed because that simply is the kehillah discharging their obligation to refund any kind of expenses that was incurred in taking care of the project. So that's an important point. We discussed last time about Quicken Loans and buying and selling mortgages. That's in Sif Aleph and Sif Yud and Sif Chaf. So we covered that. That's obviously a very important discussion that emerges from the Siman. There is a discussion in the very, very end of the Siman in Sif Chaf Hey about the nemanus that a lender has to say that the transaction that they collected Ribbis from was a Ribbis-free transaction that had been done Kedasu Kedin, and that there was no Ribbis that was actually collected, and that it was done with a non-Jew as the real borrower in the transaction. So there, the Malva is generally going to be believed if he already has the mashkun, already collected the money. If he didn't collect the money, so then the lover will be able to take a shvuah to be pater. And there's a discussion about what if the Malva has a shtar, where the Ramah says that then he is allowed to collect. So that's also in the Siman further discussion. Take a look at Sif Chafei and the Meforshim over there. And there's a bit of a discussion regarding the responsibility that a Mishaleach has towards the Shliach. That's in Sif Tes Vav. Depends whether the Malva explicitly appointed the Shliach or not. And finally, there's the right to take sarsaros fees that we discussed as well in Sif Yudalid, to be able to collect brokerage fees as the case may be. And then there is what I think is really worthy of a further discussion in Sif Chaf Aleph is the Rabbi Akiva Eger that quotes the Maharit, that if a Jew gave money to a non-Jew, let's say who's going to be a manager of the money, but here, though normally if it's a non-Jewish money manager, it's going to be a problem of Ribbis, but if he gives it to him as like an iska, where the non-Jew is going to do a daita denavshe ka'abid, that he's going to get a 50% cut from all of the profits of the transaction. So somehow he says that makes it permissible. And there's a big question as to why it is that it makes it permissible. So the Erech Shai says it's not permissible unless the non-Jew loaned the money to Jews shelo b'reshus, in which case he's doing it ultra virus. So it's not considered to be a loan from the Jew himself. And others say that maybe it's only usher when the Jew explicitly tells the non-Jew to loan out the money to Jews, but if he didn't tell him, he just knows that he's probably going to loan it to Jews, that it is going to be okay. And I think that that is maybe worthy of its own Chaburah regarding a variety of different stock and investment structures and instruments, and when they're going to be problematic and when they're not going to be problematic. And I think that Rabbi Akiva Eger and that Maharit certainly factor into that discussion. So I wanted to point that out as well. But of course, the end of the discussion is Od Chazon the Moed, that there's more time, Baruch Hashem, that we had over the course of the rest of the year to discuss some of these inyanim in greater length. But I think that hopefully this gives us all a better handle and less of an intimidation factor when it comes to Siman Kuf Samach Tes. Not as bad as one would have thought. It really is understandable. It is digestible. We haven't covered everything, but we really covered a lot, I think, in terms of going through the Sifrim and the different scenarios and what the major principles are. And I hope that this will all be the Toelis of Hagdil Torah Ladir.